Over the past few weeks, we've listened to the husband, the wife, and the mistress. We've explored loneliness, betrayal, unmet needs, poor decisions, and the complicated ways adults justify the choices they make. Each of them had a story, each of them had a reason, each of them believed they understood the cost. Yet, there's often another group of people in these stories whose voices rarely make it into the conversation. The children. While the adults were busy explaining themselves, the children were watching. While the adults were arguing, forgiving, leaving, returning, hiding, hoping, or hurting, the children were learning. This is a part of the story we do not talk about often enough. Children spend years studying relationships before they understand them. Long before they can name what they were witnessing, they're forming conclusions about love, conflict, respect, trust, and belonging. They notice who apologizes and who never does. They notice who gets their way and who keeps the peace. They notice whether disagreements end in resolution or resentment. They notice whether affection is given freely or withheld as punishment. They notice who feels safe to speak and who learns to stay quiet. Most importantly, they notice what becomes normal. Adults often underestimate how much children absorb. We assume they're too young to understand, when in reality, they're busy collecting evidence about how relationships work. They may not understand why their parents argue, why one parent withdraws, why another becomes controlling, why affection disappears, or why tension hangs in the air like a permanent guest. What they do understand is that sometimes something has changed. Children are often the quietest people in the room, yet they're usually the ones paying the closest attention. The strange thing about childhood is that we absorb lessons long before we're capable of questioning them. By the time we become adults, many of these lessons feel less like beliefs and more like facts. That is why every family passes something down. Sometimes the inheritance looks obvious. It arrives in the form of faith, resilience, kindness, or generosity. Sometimes it's a strong work ethic, an enduring sense of loyalty, or the belief that families should remain connected through life's difficulties. Other inheritances are less visible. Fear can be passed down just as effectively as courage. Silence can travel through generations as easily as wisdom. Some families pass on ability to love deeply, while others unknowingly pass on habits of avoidance, emotional distance, or people pleasing. And sometimes the inheritance is a blueprint nobody intended to leave behind. Perhaps this is what people mean when they speak of generational blessings and generational curses. They rarely arrive as dramatic events. More often, they appear as patterns repeated so often that they become tradition, accepted for so long that they begin to feel normal, and inherited so quietly that few people stop to question them. What happens next is where the story begins to split. Some children grow up and repeat what they witnessed, not because they consciously choose to, but because what feels familiar often feels right. The daughter who watched her mother shrink herself to keep the peace may one day find herself doing the same. The son who learned that men do not talk about feelings may become a man who struggles to speak when it matters most. The child who grew up in a house where love and anxiety lived side by side may spend years confusing one for the other. The patterns continue quietly and often invisibly. Then there are those who spend their lives running in the opposite direction. They make private promises to themselves. They promise that they will never stay as long as their mother stayed, never speak to their children the way they were spoken to, never make another person feel small, and never become the parents they spent years trying to understand. Some keep those promises. Others discover that breaking a cycle is far harder than recognizing one. Awareness is only the beginning. Healing requires the uncomfortable work of examining what was normal, questioning what was inherited, and deciding what deserves to be carried forward. Many people spend years doing exactly that. They revisit old memories with new understanding. They re-examine family loyalties. They begin to see that their parents were neither heroes nor villains, but flawed human beings carrying inheritances of their own. For some, that journey leads to compassion. For others, it leads to anger. For most, it leads to an uneasy mixture of both. The greatest challenge is not recognizing the pattern. The greatest challenge is refusing to pass it on. That is how generational blessings are created. That is also how generational curses survive. One generation accepts a behavior, the next normalizes it. The generation after that mistakes it for truth until somebody decides the pattern ends here. This is why the husband, the wife, and the mistress are only a part of the story. They tell one version of events. The children often carry another. It's usually a quieter story, but it lasts much longer. Long after the adults have moved on, found new relationships, rewritten history, or convinced themselves that everyone has healed. The children are often still making sense of what happened. They're still deciding which parts of their inheritance deserve to be carried forward and which parts must end with them. Some spend adulthood paying therapy bills for decisions they never made. Some spend years discovering that love and anxiety are not the same thing. Some spend decades unlearning what was considered normal in their childhood homes. Perhaps the unshakable truth is this: children do not inherit the affair, they do not inherit the argument, they do not inherit the divorce, they inherit the blueprint. The blueprint for how conflict is handled, the blueprint for how love is given, the blueprint for what is tolerated, the blueprint for what becomes normal. Some will repeat it, some will reject it, some will spend years healing from it, and some will do the difficult work of transforming it into something better for the generation that follows. Perhaps that is where generational blessings and generational curses are really born. Not in the grand moments, in the ordinary homes, in ordinary relationships, in ordinary choices made every day. And perhaps this is why when we talk about relationships, marriage, betrayals, and heartbreak, we should spend a little less time asking who was right and who was wrong, and a little more time considering who was watching. The children always were. If this is your first stop in this series, perhaps take a moment to listen to parts 1, 2, and 3. The husband, the wife, and the mistress. Their stories may be different, but they all lead here. See you next week.